All right. So there has been a lot of debate about which route did St. Thomas come, and how did the gospel reach this part of the world? Uh, Now, some part of it we are not 100% sure of, because we know that the early apostles did not leave Jerusalem, even though the church got scattered, even when the Jerusalem church faces persecution. And all that is happening in Acts itself. We can see that. But the apostles stayed put. And we see that they stayed put all the way till Acts 15, which is in terms of timeline, it is at least 10 to 12 years after the day of Pentecost. Okay, after the birth of the church. So we are talking something that's happening approximately, if we take 33 AD as the date, we have to talk of something past 45 AD, right? So till the Jerusalem Council, we are pretty sure that all the apostles who are alive are still together. They're still there. But after that, extra biblical material tells us that all of these apostles prayed and picked lots and traveled to the ends of the earth to carry the gospel. All right. And we are not told why. We are not told what suddenly changed for them to leave. But as far as we know, from the history of where all the apostles went, we do have solid evidence of all of them. Everyone, including Matthias, the one who was chosen to replace Judas. We have evidence of where they went, where they preached, and who came to the Lord because of their ministry. All of this is well recorded in history. All right. Of course, we don't have the time to cover all of that. And we are just picking Thomas today and briefly mentioning Bartholomew. All right. That's about it. That's the only two apostles we're kind of covering today. And this is how we can see what happened to the East. But if you are interested, the materials are available on all of the 12 apostles plus Paul, 13 apostles. All right. So all the 13 and where all they went and what all they did is available in church history. Now, apparently, Thomas picked up India in his lots. And now we may wonder, how can you know where India was and what is going on? And one of the things that comes to us very clearly now in hindsight is that there was a Jewish trade route all the way to Kerala. And this is well established today, even archaeologically. All right. So archaeologically, we know that there was a Jewish presence from the times of Solomon, and we have found coins, we have found artifacts which are from that time. So that means the Jewish presence in Kerala is really old, all the way back to the times of Solomon, and that puts trade routes and everything quite a kind of like a well-known thing to the Jews. And as far as we know, most of the apostles followed Jewish trade routes because they were all going down to take the gospel to the Jews wherever they were in the corners of the world. And it is probably, now we don't have any written evidence of this, but it is probably because of that that Thomas set out to go all the way to Kerala, to India. All right. And that's probably why he's taking this route. Now, we have evidences of people who are writing about it, and I will quickly touch on these. And obviously, you can get into a lot more details and find out about them. So, the Apostle Thomas and his route with the gospel, one of the church fathers called Eusebius, he refers to Parthia and the Persian Empire as St. Thomas's work in the gospel. And this is quoted, he is quoting Origen. Origen is one of the earlier church fathers. All right. So you can see that Eusebius is quoting Origen, and Origen is writing this much earlier. And you can see that they both are mentioning Thomas as the one who's taken the gospel to what we would say Persia is basically today modern day Iran. Parthia is the surrounding regions like Iraq and all that. And so apparently Thomas took the gospel to these regions. Another church father, Hippolytus, writes that Thomas preached to the Parthians, the Medes, the Persians, the Haratians, the Bactrians, the Margians, and he was finally thrust through the four members of his body with a pine spear at Kalamani in a city in India, and he was buried there. So we have these kind of writings. Again, Hippolytus is an early church father who's writing this. So by then it is well established that Thomas has taken the gospel through this route. The people called Bactrians are basically what today we would call Afghanistan. All right. And Margians are again surrounding regions from there, like the Pakistan and those regions. The word that is used here for the city in India, which we would associate as Mylapore or today the outskirts of Chennai, is called in those days as Kalaman, right? And again, this is there in multiple writings, and historians have had a lot of back and forth debate on where is this place, because this name is no longer available in modern history. One of the earliest and most notable witnesses is Didacleia Apostolorum, which is basically a Latin word meaning teaching of the apostles. It's a book. This is a book, right? And this book was probably produced in Syria around the date of 250 AD, all right? So the teachings of the apostles is a book which is available from quite old. And this contained a statement that India and all its own countries and those bordering on it, even to the farthest sea, received the apostles' hand of the priesthood from Judas Thomas, who was the guide and ruler in the church, which he built and ministered there. Judas Thomas is none other than the Apostle Thomas, all right? So this again puts the evidence very strongly in favor of Thomas having come to India. Much later evidences are there of the tomb of Thomas, like Marco Polo comes in 1288 and 1292 and visits the tomb of Thomas. We have Theodore, who is from the 6th century AD, telling Gregory, the Bishop of Tours, of St. Thomas's tomb, which is available as a reference in India. And Saint Ephraim, which is again another early church father who's referring to the St. Thomas and his burial in Edessa. So all of this is again writings from people, unfortunately not from within India. All of these are from outside India. We have always been pretty bad at documenting our own history, but thanks to the writings of many people from outside, they are referring the fact that Thomas has come and he came to all the way to Kerala, and of course finally he died in Mylapore. So he apparently arrives through the land route and travels through through the sea route from Gujarat and ends up in Kodungalur port in 52 AD on the shores of Kerala, because there was an existing Jewish colonies apparently there. And the interesting thing is, it's said that there were 7 large Jewish colonies in that region. And interestingly or coincidentally, he establishes what is called as the 7.5 churches. So again, there are those who speculate that his primary audience were the Jews, and that those Jews who then finally became Christians were the ones who became these 7.5 church settlements. All right. Now, again, we don't have any documentary proof of this, though there have been some interesting evidences due to DNA in recent times. All right. So apparently, it is now come to the fore that at least 1 in 10 Syrian Christians have Jewish blood. And out of that, 1 in 4 is from the tribe of Kohens or the Levites, right? Apparently. So it's interesting. Now DNA is proving all of this, but what is shocking is that all of this is recorded in history, came down as legend, no documentary evidence, but it is, as we say, stories passed down, which seems to be more or less today proven to be true, right? And these locations of the 7.5 churches are all famously even there in Kerala today, though the churches themselves are not from the first century. They have, of course, gone through many renovations and many changes over time. All right. Apparently, Thomas traveled to Sri Lanka, to the east coast, Malaysia and China. And of course, finally, he dies in Mylapore near Chennai. We do have evidence of all the other places, including Sri Lanka. We don't have evidences in any way of Malaysia. At least I have not seen the evidences anywhere. So I should say very honestly, I'm not seen for Malaysia and China. Though again, by word of mouth, there is a claim that Thomas went there also. Here is another descriptive narrative that is of the records found in early church history, which connects, and it's again, as I said, Hippolytus, the bishop of Portus in AD 220, who's mentioning that Bartholomew also preached in India. All right. And another bishop from the 3rd century mentions that the apostle Thomas preached the gospel to the Parthians and suffered martyrdom. Again, that name, Calamina, slight changes in spelling, slight changes in pronunciation, but this name is brought again and again about the town in India, right? Again, the church father John Chrysostom, again from the 4th century, he also writes about the tomb of Thomas. And he says that it is as well venerated as the tomb of Peter in Rome. All right. So that means there was quite a pilgrimage to the Thomas, to the tomb of Thomas in India. Again, another church father, again, Saint Gregory, he's also identifying the ministry of Thomas in India. And again, so there are so many these kind of external evidences. One of them mentions, and this is again known in legend, that the remains of Apostle Thomas were removed from India to Edessa. Edessa is basically in Turkey, all right? And the date and removal was assigned to 394 in the Chronicles of Edessa. We must remember the church in Antioch was the strongest crux of Eastern Christianity. And therefore, we are not surprised in the 4th century that they would have done something like this just to protect the remains of the apostle, right? This is, again, not a surprising practice. Both the Catholic Church also does this. Wherever they find the remains of the apostles, they would take it and go back to Vatican and keep it there. So this has happened to all of the remains of the apostles that were known in history. Saint Jerome mentions the field of ministry of the apostle Thomas to India and his death in the town Calamina. So again, multiple people who are saying the same thing. And obviously, and I'm only taking the early references. Later, though, there are lots of people who are saying this, but of course, they would be referring to the earlier references. But the earlier references of people, we are still talking before 4th century AD. There are all of these people who are saying the same thing, right? So again, I'm continuing. There are others who are mentioning this. I won't mention it again. But the fact that it is more or less well established that Thomas did come. All right. Here is Ephraim Cyrus, who identifies India, St. Thomas with India in his hymns, and a writer who's identified as an Edessian, and the author of the Doctrine of the Apostles mentions India as the field of ministry of St. Thomas. There are some who personally traveled to India, and we can then also use them as witnesses of the church and the work of St. Thomas. In 189 AD, there is a missionary from Alexandria, Pantanius, and he arrives in India. And so there is evidence from his details that he sees the church in India and attributes it to Thomas. In 200 AD, there is the Syriac Chronicle of Edessa, which describes the Church of the Christians in India. So there is already a well-established church in India that is attributed by 200 AD. 345 AD, during the great persecution that breaks out in Persia, there is, of course, the popular mention of Thomas. It said Thomas from Cana. He leads about 400 Christian refugees to the Malabar coast. Now, this has been mentioned in different ways. One is about fleeing some persecution event in there, but in other ways also it has been mentioned as a response to help during a time of trouble to the church in Kerala. All right. And so whatever it is, there is a strong evidence of somebody called Thomas of Cana who comes to the Malabar coast. All right. So like I've mentioned, we have the strong tradition. Apparently, Thomas traveled the route that is what we would call from Jordan up through the regions of what would be Syria, Iraq, Iran, and then come down through Afghanistan and Pakistan, through North India, through Gujarat, and then he's using a sea route to go all the way to the coast of Kerala. Right. So this is now more or less the latest understanding of the route that Thomas has taken. We've earlier had debates whether Thomas used a direct route, and direct routes were available through sea from the coast of Yemen. And I'm not getting into the history of that. There have been routes through the sea that have been mentioned like that, that Jews have used. But as far as now, the latest evidence that we have, it kind of seems to prove that he used the land route for most of his journey. And then only the last part, when he arrives in Kerala, he's using the sea route, which is through Gujarat till the coast. One more reason for this fact getting affirmed is that even though we don't accept the Acts of Thomas as a inspired work, and we think what we have is a corrupted version of it, but there are elements of the story that kind of has been correlated in history now. So one of the kings that is mentioned that in the Acts of Thomas is a king called Gundaphrus, and the king is apparently supposed to be in the region of northwest India. And this would be what we would today call Afghanistan, parts of Afghanistan, and maybe a small part of Pakistan. All right, the regions of Taxila and all of that. All right. So what is apparently mentioned in the Acts of Thomas is the story of Thomas being invited by the king of Gundaphrus to come and build him a palace. And then there is a lot of exaggerated story about Thomas having built a palace in heaven and then taken money from the king and then not returned that money and not built the palace. The king gets angry, and when he asks Thomas, Thomas says he built it in heaven. And so the king gets angry and puts him in jail. Then the king's brother dies. He goes to heaven. He sees the palace in heaven. And then he comes back and tells the king that, no, there is a palace in heaven. And the king becomes a Christian. This is so far the story that is kind of in a nutshell that is narrated in the Acts of Thomas. So obviously there is a lot of exaggeration, and which is one of the reasons why we don't acknowledge the Acts of Thomas as a pure work that we have. Probably it was originally written by Thomas, we don't know, but it's definitely not the original work that we have in our hands today. But one of the things that historians laughed about was that there was never a king called Gundaphrus. Through history, we never knew of a king like this. There was no king called Gondapharus. And so all the historians laughed and said there was nothing like this and it's a made up story and all of that. But in 1980s, in the second half of the 20th century, archaeological evidence threw up that there was a king called Gondapharus and that his region of his land was like an overlap of what we would call today's Afghanistan and Pakistan. So there is a real king. And then the second part of it was that they found out that his timeline, the existence of Gondapharus as a king, was during the first century. So that also became a very difficult thing for historians to ignore. So we can see that there is some element of truth. Thomas definitely seems to have met a king called Gondapharus, and something like that has happened. But maybe the rest of the story is, we don't know, how far it is made up and where it is corrupted. But he definitely seems to have come through that route in the first century. And it seems therefore all the more to establish that there is a land route that he has used to come. That is one. Second is, there are places, there is at least one known place in Pakistan, today's Pakistan, that is actually named after Thomas. And so apparently the early Christians who came to the Lord were, through the ministry of Thomas. And there is a place in Pakistan which is named after him. And so that's also something interesting. Today, it is very difficult for us to believe, but we must understand that Pakistan, before independence in 1947, at that time, there were apparently more than 10 to 12% Christians in Pakistan. Today, of course, it's very challenging for us to understand because it's less than 1% Christianity in Pakistan. But it was once upon a time much more than us, a percentage of Christians that were there. All right. So, and they all associate themselves as St. Thomas Christians. So there is a tradition of what is called as St. Thomas Christians across Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan and Pakistan, and even apparently in some parts of North India, that there used to be a thriving Christian population, right? All right. So all of our evidences, documentary corroboration, all comes from outside. We don't have anything well established within our own communities to even rely on for any of this. All right. Okay. This place, Edessa, like I said, it's a place that is presently in Turkey and is documented to have a Christian presence right from the first century. And there is a mention again of a missionary named Adai, a disciple of Thomas, and he's credited with preaching in Edessa and establishing the Christian worship there. This area was a hub from where Christianity spread across to Mesopotamia, Persia, and other regions. This is not surprising because remember one of the key places of Christianity is the Antioch, which is in Turkey today. Right? And so we are not surprised. And Antioch served as the capital of Eastern Christianity between Constantinople or what would later be considered as the Eastern branches of Christianity. All of the so-called Orthodox branches of Christianity come from their association with Antioch. All right. Missionary activity is also associated with all the places that is so-called Parthia, Persia, and all of that, which we already mentioned. One of the key differences between the Eastern and the Western churches were the use of language. Western churches tended towards Latin, and the Eastern churches retained Greek and Aramaic languages, and they continue to use that as their means of maintaining the scriptures and also use of theological documentation within the church. The Church of the East, which later came to be known as the Nestorian Church, became a well-established church in Persia, and it served as a base for missions deep into Asia. We have verbal and somewhat well-established accounts of missionaries who have come from so-called Iran all the way to Kerala. We will talk about it a little later, but there was a point at which the church in Kerala went through a lot of persecution and became almost extinct. And at those times, they reached out for help, and their call for help went to two places. One is to the church in Persia, and the other is to the church in Antioch. So it was from Antioch and Persia that the help came to kind of support the church in Kerala. Which is why the church in Kerala has this prefix of what is called as Syrian Orthodox attached to it. The Syrian Orthodox is basically coming because of Antioch. All right, we have no other influence of Syriac in our origin, but Syriac and all of the aspects of the Syrian church is only coming from the 4th century and later, when we called out for help and they sent their bishops and other people to come and help us. And because of that, this word Syrian Orthodox started becoming the common word for us. All right. The traditions of 1st century Christianity reaching China. Now, this is something very interesting, but highly disputed. Okay, I want you to understand that this is highly disputed. There is a tradition that the 1st century itself, Christianity reached China. And there is a writing of someone called Arnobus, who's writing around 300 AD. And he mentions that the gospel has already been preached in China. And so that's a very interesting thing. Chinese Christianity is also quite early, quite ancient, and and though we see the resurgence and the kind of powerful movement of the missionaries in the last century in China, but apparently the gospel did reach them in the 1st century itself. The oldest physical evidence is what is called as the Nestorian stone, and this is available from 635 AD. But the tradition of earlier arrival persists in both Christians and the later Chinese sources. So the Nestorian stone is something that shows us that at least from the 7th century, definitely China did have Christianity. All right. But how far back before the 7th century? Does it go all the way back to the 1st century? We are not sure. Of course, we have no doubt about Antioch and major regions in the Middle East which came to Christ. And these regions were well evangelized by apostles like Peter, Barnabas, Paul. And of course, we know that we were first called Christians in Antioch. Christianity spread rapidly across the Levant and into the Roman-dominated Asia Minor. And from there, missionary activity eventually extended into the Caucasus, Arabia, and other trade routes that existed way far out beyond the Middle East. All right. Contemporary written records from the 1st century in Asia are scarce, and early church writings, Christian writings from later centuries consistently reference apostolic missions eastward. 3rd century, there have been references of Christian communities indicating that they had an earlier foundation. In fact, in some of these writings, we have records of around 13 dioceses that exist between the places of what we would call as modern day Syria to Afghanistan. 13 dioceses existed of Christians in these regions, and they're all attributed mostly to the work of Thomas. The dating and spread of New Testament documents with some early fragments are found as far as Egypt by the 2nd century and further point to rapid dissemination of Christian writings, which has included Asia. All right. So we can see that the gospel has quickly spread right in the first century all the way to the shores of Kerala. And we also see that Thomas, when he arrived there, he took the gospel down the coast through Kerala's side and then went up the coast through what would be today's Tamil Nadu coast all the way up to Chennai. All right. And so this is the path that we can see that was taken by him. There are no archaeological artifacts or that are available or any inscriptions of this sort, all right, of Thomas and his work. But we do have the churches that existed, and they are dated to the first century quite conclusively, and it confirms the Christian presence. Tangible evidence of this comes later, and though there is a strong oral tradition, it does suggest a early route. Okay, when we look at regions like Persia, Central Asia, and China, apparently there are so-called Christian crosses, tombstones, inscriptions. Inscriptions have been unearthed in places like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and China. But the earliest securely dated finds are generally from 3rd to 7th century, not earlier than that. Okay, so again, we can't go all the way back to the time of the 1st century as much as we would like. Another aspect is so-called Nestorian stele. The Nestorian stele is basically like a big stone artifact. It would be about as big as my hands are showing on the screen now, and it would be about as tall as maybe about 2 to 3 feet. And that round cylindrical thing is what would be called as the stele. And we find that the Nestorian steles are found in China, but they are still dating only to much later, 781 AD. And what is the purpose of these steles? These steles are basically used to record history. So there will be inscriptions on it, which will just basically mention some events of history, and that helps us to remember things, right? So that's how we have some evidences later on. Okay, there are key Christian center records from places like Edessa, which is in today Turkey, and of course from places like Antioch. Okay, with these written records are what are kind of helping us to establish that yes, there was Christian presence and their activity. All right. Okay, so we've covered what we know as the journey of Thomas. We know that there are many places that are holding evidence as associated with Thomas. And when we go further, we can see that he dies in Chennai in a place that is today called as St. Thomas Mount. And the Santom Church is supposed to be believed to be where he was buried. The tomb is there. And the St. Thomas Mount is the place where he was martyred. And there's another place close by called Little Mount, where it's a cave, which is traditionally associated with his last days and the miracles that he did before he was martyred. Okay. Okay, so when we ask the question of impact, how did the gospel impact us and what happened? This is a picture of ancient India. Mauryan Empire, of which the famous person that we know is Ashoka. Ashoka is apparently a person who converts to Buddhism after the Great War at Kalinga. And this Mauryan Empire is the history of his ancestry. And that this is basically mapping what we call, what we know as 250 BC, all right? And the Ashokan Empire lasted till 5 BC, all right? I mean, till just before what we could call the work of Christ in Asia, in Jerusalem and those regions. This is 5 BC, about 5 years before the uh, turn of the millennium there. So why I have this map is for you to look at what India would have looked like politically. All the brown regions are the Mayuran Empire. And as you can see, it goes all the way to what we would today call as Afghanistan, Kandahar. You can see the left corner there is Kandahar. And you can see just after that is what is called as the Seleucid Empire. Seleucid Empire would be the Greek Empire that was during Alexander's time, all right? And post-Alexander. So you can see that the southern tip of India shown on the map is actually divided among 3 kingdoms. And you can see that it's marked as the Kerala Putras, the Pandyas, and the Cholas. So there are these groups that are known and have ruled over these regions little before first AD and all the way after till about 4th century. All right. Now it is said that when Thomas came and got the gospel to this region, well, there might have been early presence of what is today called as the Aryans or the Brahmins and others who would have just basically just barely established themselves in these regions. What is known is that even though Thomas took the gospel across the coast, from the left side, what is Kerala, to the right side, what is called as Tamil Nadu's coast, yet by the time we come to the 4th century, all of what is on the right side got wiped out. And the reason for this is that the Cheras, or what is mapped here as the Kerala Putras, the Cheras and the Cholas were at war with each other most of the history. And the Cholas were very, very religious. And the Cholas wiped out Christianity wherever they saw it. And whereas the Cheras had good relationship with the Christians, and therefore Christianity thrived on the left side and did not thrive on the right side. And it is said that this persecution was so intense that it affected, even though it was not able to wipe out on the left side, but it did affect them. And by the time we come to the 4th century, the church in Kerala, which was thriving in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries, started declining and came to a very, very severe situation in 4th century. And at this point is when they reach out for help. They sent emissaries to Antioch and to Persia, and they ask for help. And that's how the bishops are sent from there to help the church. We can see that in 295 AD to 399 AD, there are presence of people from what is called as Basra. The Bishop of Basra, David, has left his so-called what would be called as the congregational section of where he is, and he came to India, and he apparently evangelized many people here in the 4th century. Among the bishops who signed the decrees in the First General Council of the Church at Nicaea in 325 AD, we have talked about Nicene Council earlier. One of them was this John of Persia, who signed as representing the churches in the whole of Persia and Great India. So there is a bishop that is representing this region, which is at the Nicene Council. 354 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantinus sends a Christian embassy to certain countries under the leadership of a of Aryan bishop known as Theophilus the Indian. So apparently there is a reference to people who are Christian in India. A Syriac commentary on the Epistle of Romans was produced at Edessa, and it contains this note: this epistle has been translated from Greek into Syriac by Mark Omai with the help of Daniel the priest, the Indian. And this is written around 425 AD. So all these secondary evidences are what we have, okay, that there is a presence of church in this region, and it is a very strong evidence that there is a presence, but it's not a direct evidence, it is an indirect evidence. A Syriac scholar, Manna, who's the bishop of Rivasdarar in Persia, about 720 AD, he writes a treatise and hymns of his own translated work from Greek into Syriac. And the works of Antiochus the theologian, and Diodor of Tarsus, and Theodore of Mopsuestia is recorded to have sent all to India all the books that he had translated. Now, why would you send Christian books to a place if there are no Christians there? So obviously he's sending it to India because there is a strong Christian presence here, and these books are being sent to help the Christians in this place. Likewise, we have accounts of 522 AD by a Christian merchant of Alexandria called Cosmas, who writes a book, Universal Christian Topography, in which he mentions the Christian church in inner India in Malabar region. Now, the word Malabar is also visible, all right? It is now becoming more clearer, and the words like Malabar and all that are starting to become visible by the time we come to 5th, 6th century, all right? Now, this man is actually a businessman. He's not writing any Christian book. He's just writing, you could say, like a business guide. But in his business guide, he's mentioning the church in India, which is in Malabar. We see the dependency of the church on the church of Antioch or Persia in order to handle the consecration. So the bishops were consecrated and overseen through the influence of Antioch or Persia. And this helped them to remain under the control and diocese from a larger perspective. So this kind of also established a little more credibility for the church, because the people in India would view this as something that is, you could say, a larger influence, and often that was viewed positively. So what we can see is that this Syrian church has traditions of two major immigrations of influential people. And first is about so-called about 300 to 400 people, families, that is coming under clergy under the leadership of so-called Thomas of Cana. And they're arriving at the directive of the king of Edessa and the bishop of Edessa around 345 AD. The second immigration is dated to much later, 823 AD, when a number of Christians from Persia, including two bishops, come to Coilon in Travancore and settle there. All of these people obtained grants of land and other privileges from the kings here. Okay, so those kind of evidences are also available. I've heard accounts of people receiving some kind of a token from the king, which kind of establish the grant of land and other things. There are 5 carved stone monuments that have been discovered in South India. The first at St. Thomas Mount, Mylapore, the others at Kottayam in Kerala, and in other places in Kerala. And the inscription has been generally accepted to say, "My Lord Christ, have mercy upon Aphras, the son of Chaharabukht, the Syrian, who cut this." Now that's interesting, isn't it? Here is an artifact that is talking about a Syrian who is a Christian, who is a masonry of some sort, a person who works with stone, and he's cut the same stone monument, 5 of them, and it has been found in different regions, and which kind of gives us an idea about what these would have been used for and what the purpose of it is. So it gives a solid evidence of the church existing in South India at that time. And it's at Mylapore as well as in Malabar. So you can see two ends, two different coast ends, one in Malabar and one in Mylapore. But it's from by the same person, and establishing the association between the two places. Like I said, the church suffered a severe persecution in the 4th century, and for self-preservation, it was cut off from the Western church. And as it went forward, they had to face also the rising influence of Islam. And Islam dealt very severely in wiping out Christianity, and they did it in various ways. One of the things that you'll find is that legally the status of Christians was that of a recognized minority under the Muslim rule. Now, Islam rises in the 7th century and comes to full fore in the 9th and 10th century. And in that process, they started converting these regions by force. So they had two, three ways of doing this. One was they would force the Christians to pay a special tax, and they would force them to wear a distinctive dress. And it was prohibited to convert a Muslim. You can't evangelize. And if you evangelize, it would be death. Yet the Christians were valued for their superior education and were in demand for government offices, and thus they had ability to exercise some influence. All right. So this is the situation that comes about by the time we reach the 8th century and forward. Later on in the Middle Ages, due to the consequences of the Crusades, which were undertaken by the Europeans, the relationship between Muslims and Christians deteriorated very rapidly and very badly. And there was often persecution because the Muslims were antagonized by the Crusades, and the church was increasingly weakened in Asia. So the centuries from the 11th to 14th century was a time of eruption and movement among the Turkish and the Mongolian peoples of Central Asia. And by the 11th century, Seljuk Turks invaded Persia and spread over the whole of Western Asia. In the 13th century, the Mongols united under Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, though he was not a Muslim, but whatever version of religion he followed, and people are not very sure, though some claim Buddhism, but Genghis Khan conquered vast tracts of country that range from China, Central Asia to Russia. And remember, I told you that between the regions of so-called Syria till Afghanistan, there were more than 13 dioceses of Christians. Well, all of that was wiped out by Genghis Khan. This is what is happening in the 13th century, 12th and 13th century. And the Turks eventually went and accepted Islam. And the Mongols eventually, after Genghis Khan, they too eventually accepted Islam. In the 15th century, this resulting descendants, out of which comes one called Timur, or what is called as Tamerlane, he wiped out the churches across China and Central Asia completely. And North India suffered an invasion from him in 1398 AD. And there were many Christian communities that were wiped out in North India also. And so you can see that the thriving church of the East was completely wiped out and completely destroyed into an insignificant community through this. So this is how we see that all the traces of what St. Thomas did got wiped out, and only this fledgling community in Kerala survived. Islam didn't reach that far down at that point, and so we see that they survived for much longer. Now we can always ask why, but it's the grace of God that this church, at least in Kerala, survived. But the path through which all the other places were evangelized by St. Thomas, all of that was wiped out. All right. We've already seen a little evidence of what happens through the 13th century later on, when people like Marco Polo and others from the European nations come and discover the Christian community in India. But the next big thing that happens is when the Portuguese come, and the Portuguese are coming only by the 15th century. All right. Till the 15th century, the strongest presence of Christians in India is only this so-called St. Thomas community or the Syrian Christians. The Syrian Christian community is the only community that is there within the borders of modern India. All right. Again, I have evidences of people who visited, who are coming from what we would today call as the Catholic churches in the East, in the West. And they're coming to the East and visiting places, and they're seeing and getting to know that there is the so-called St. Thomas Christians in these places. All right. Okay. So let me kind of pause here, and we've covered how Christianity came into the country. But I'm just today telling you for your reference, if you see Christians in modern India, all right, in modern India, they come from the work of different mission agencies through history. The earliest, we can categorize them into four. The earliest, and mind you, while I'm doing this categorization, I must acknowledge that these are only the broad categories. There are categories that are in between, which are not falling into any of the four also. All right. So don't think that I'm comprehensive, but this is mostly the four categories in which we can find Christians in India. St. Thomas Christians, which we already established, 52 AD onwards, and brought by St. Thomas. Portuguese Christians are basically Catholic influences, and the Portuguese, when they came and established themselves sorry, in Goa, and that is happening in the 15th century. Okay, 15th century means we are now talking 1500 AD, and 1500 AD and about. So what you have is the Portuguese coming and establishing a base in Goa, and from Goa they are going to other regions around the country. So when they came down south, they found that these so-called St. Thomas Christians are already here. And initially they have good relationships, but later on that relationship also becomes sour. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next time, not next time, in session 9 and 10. We will talk about that. All right. So I'm not covering that here, but there are incidents of what goes wrong between the Christians within India also. At this point also, so-called Northeast Christians are not yet established, and neither is the CSI and CNI established. The Northeast Christians are established only in the 1800 AD, and we will talk about that in a moment. Okay. Now, the other group that is coming is modern missionary efforts that are coming after the British colonized India. And that is happening only after the so-called 19th century. That means through 1800s. And initially, when the British established in India, the missionaries did not come. In the early, like in the 1700s, when the first so-called bases were established, it was purely military and trading. But later on, the English missionaries fought actually a legal battle and got the permission to travel to India. So that is why they come only in the 1800s. And you'll find that they established a lot of churches through various denominational groupings. Again, this we will not talk today. We will talk all of this in the last session. But they are the ones who then established many independent churches in India, denominational churches. And all of this, when the British had to leave in 1947, they had to leave behind all of this also. So what happens is when the missionaries leave, they decided to put all of it together into one grouping called as the Churches of North India and the Churches of South India, and which was formed in 1947 AD. So this is a denominational group that is coming only in 1947. All right. And this is coming because of British independence. And this is not a uniform group. Each of the churches are different from each other. All right. Some were formed by Brethren, some were formed by Baptist, some were formed by somebody else, Lutherans, and so on. But all of them were grouped together and put under one banner called CSI and CNI. All right. So again, as you look at the quick timeline, I'm just giving you a reference. You can see that there's a lot of empty gap on the right side. St. Thomas Christians have been here from the 1st century, but there is nobody else in this part of the world till we come to the 1400s, when the first Portuguese presence comes. And that's where we see that the Portuguese come. And you can see that the Portuguese are establishing, and we can see that there was some disputes between the St. Thomas Christian and the Portuguese. We'll talk about these things in the last session. In 1800s, also we can see the so-called St. Thomas Christians and the Reformation movements that are happening amongst them. But it is at this period that we see Catholic presence also growing through the Portuguese Christians. And the Northeast Christians were established in 1836 by American Baptist missionaries. What is different though is that the Northeast rapidly was evangelized. Even today, Northeast states, especially Mizoram and Meghalaya and all of those, they're predominantly Christian. And of course, there are reasons for it. But what I'm getting to is that evangelism was very effective in their midst. And they are majority Christians even today. And today, of course, they have lost all traces of their tribal roots, except for some cultural elements. All right. And so that's how Northeast becomes Christian. CNI and CSI, as I mentioned, 1947 onwards, churches under the British control. So this is briefly the history that we have. All right. And yeah, we can ask some questions, we can get into some details, but I'll just quickly point out one lesson that we can pick up from this. And it's in the context of evangelism. And not a direct evangelism that I want to talk about here, but I want us to see that God is the primary missionary. When we look at all this, what do we see? That he's been working from the 1st century onwards, when he brought the gospel to Kerala. He's been working through the centuries. He's been working in different places way before us. And he is the one who takes the gospel to each generation and everywhere. We are not the primary missionaries. We are the followers. We've asked the question, what is God doing and how can I partner with him? We must see God at work ahead of us. And this is a very important principle in missions. We need to see that God is the one who is at work before us. And we should ask, what are you doing so that I can join you? And that's important in our perspective as missionaries and as evangelists. All right, so I leave this lesson with you to consider. God has been at work even in our land much earlier. The question we have to ask is, how can we partner with him in this generation? How can we partner with him for our nation today? How can we partner with him, and what is he doing in this country that we should be effective in his hands for the gospel? All right, so that's the lesson I leave with you. It's related to the mission and the evangelism, but uh, it's more about seeing God as the primary missionary. All right. Okay. So questions. I hope you understood the lesson also. If not, please feel free to ask. Okay. Again, there's a lot of detail. Uh, I have just briefly just outlined the major parts of things. That's all. And yeah, we will also talk a little more about the Indian church in the last session. All right. More about the modern Indian church in the last session. We are a very complex culture, one of those difficult places. Statistically speaking, we are the last uh, last mission fields where a lot of work is pending. Okay, all around the world, we have seen missions growing, thriving, and doing a lot of things, changing people, changing nations. But India is still one of those places where the gospel is struggling. There are very few places like this where, at a national level, we can say that the gospel has still got a long way to go. Places like Japan, places like India, and a few other places like this, even the Middle East is responding now far better than India. And so I'm saying this because we have a great responsibility to the gospel. We received the gospel right in the first century. It was given to us at a great price. We have received it from the sacrifice of many, many, and people who even died for it. People like Thomas the Apostle, who gave his life onwards, to many others who have given their life for the gospel to reach us. We have a great indebtedness to the gospel. But unfortunately, we are not demonstrating that gratitude. We are failing to give it back, to respond with gratitude. And that's the failure of the Indian church even today. We are one of those places which is still not completing the task of the Great Commission, even though we've had the gospel for the last 2000 years. So consider what we ought to do today. We owe a great debt of gratitude, and we have a great responsibility to the Great Commission, right? So consider that. Any questions? Any thoughts?
Yeah, one question and a thought also.
Yeah.
So Britishers are usually perceived as thieves who stole our wealth, or who that deeply affected our early economy and all of that. But do you think Britishers' involvement in bringing together churches, is that the reason why currently people also perceive us Christians as anti-nationals? The moment you see a Christian, you are anti-national, because somewhere they think we've bought in the British ideology. But this is not an ideology originated from the Britishers, right? We are taking these insights from this little community of people that are the Jews. So that way, if you see, Britishers have nothing to do with this bunch of people. So Jesus is a Jew, and we are following this Jew. But then, when currently, when I mean, especially after Modi government, and all of that, that's the general perception. So, do you think Britishers' involvement in the early churches was also the reason? Because Britishers, for sure, was a threat to our nation.
Yeah, but let's separate the myth from the fact. The aspect of British Christianity may not be very visible upon Syrian Christians. All right. Now, if depending on the community you're coming from and the background you're coming from, Syrian Christians are absolutely non-Western in their background. Even traditionally, their culture, everything has been a very Indian culture. Okay. You can look at the Kerala churches and the way they go about things. They are very integrated culturally with their surroundings. But whereas so-called Western Christianity that we follow today, look at our churches. What is the kind of music we sing? Western. What is the kind of dressing we have? Western. What is the kind of order of service we have? Western. So you see, where is the other people around us getting this perception? This perception is coming because of the culture we are following. In the church, we are very Western. No matter how much we say that the gospel we received was not Western, and even if we say that even the strongest, oldest community here is not Western, even then, unfortunately, what we are demonstrating is Western. So, are you surprised that the depiction of Christians in, let's say, Bollywood? What is the depiction of Christians in Bollywood? The drunkard, the thief, the guy who, you look at the depiction of Christians in Bollywood, it is always coming from the beef-eating, dancing culture, the so-called, now all of that is basically coming from Western Christianity understanding, and maybe predominantly the Portuguese Goa culture. That is the depiction of Christianity that is there in Bollywood. And why is that? Because our churches are also mostly demonstrating Western culture. We have very little Eastern elements in the predominant Indian church. And whose fault is it? Well, partly it is ours. Okay, so we do have to own up to the mistakes that we are making also. The church culture is not very inherently evangelistic. It is not culturally compatible with the people around us. And that is one of our biggest hindrances to the gospel.
Yeah, thank you.
But on the other hand, I would strongly commend the work of the British missionaries, what they did and the way they sacrificed their lives to reach India. They did the best of what they could. We wouldn't fault them for what they did. So that's another thing that I would say we need to separate the colonial culture and the Western Christianity we are following and the British missionary culture that they worked and lived in India for. The other myth in all of this is that we are anti-national. We are one of the strongest communities that has contributed in percentage terms the highest amount for the Indian freedom fighting movement. The problem is today you and me are not very well aware of these facts because we read very little of our own history. But the Indian Christian community has contributed very largely to the freedom fighting movement in India. We fought against the British, even though we are Christians. We contributed big leaders to the freedom fighting movement. Let me give you an example. If you go to Delhi, I mean, you might have seen this famous picture of the 12 people with Gandhi in the front and marching. I don't know if you've ever seen that statue, the famous statue of 12 people with Gandhi marching. That is one of those freedom fighting symbols. Have you ever wondered who's the second person standing behind Gandhi? The second person standing behind Gandhi is a man called Titus. Titus is Gandhi's right-hand man, and he is from the fledgling Syrian Christian community. And he was one of the pioneers in the so-called freedom fighting movement. All right. We contributed more than 5 women to the freedom fighting movement. That too, women. At a time when women were not even involved in anything in the social structures, 5 Christian women were on the forefront of serving the freedom fighting movement. All of this has come from this fledgling Indian Christian community at the freedom fighting. So don't ever call us anti-national. We are not anti-national. We have contributed a great deal, way more than any community in India. I think if the Christians were more aware of what we have done for the freedom fighting movement, the others would stop calling us anti-national.
Actually, I felt what you said about freedom fighting was a good point, because if the first aspects that we raise as Christians' contribution to the nation is education and healthcare and other services, then the immediate counter would be, oh, you did this to manipulate. But then for freedom fighting, one might not immediately, maybe not as a first response counter as manipulation for conversion. So that's a nice point. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, this is one more reason why we should know our history, because history really gives us perspective on who we have been and who we are today. But when we don't, very often other people take us for a ride. You know? Good. All right. So continue to think, continue to look at what God is doing. We have been in this country for a reason, each one of us. And I think even as we see what God is doing through us, let's ask God to use us even today in this generation for his glory. Right? Let's pray. Loving Father, thank you for this time. Surely you're a God who's been marching through history, fulfilling your purpose. You brought us the gospel right in the first century. And many of us are a product of that work, even the direct work of people like St. Thomas. Thank you for what you did and the way in which you have been working. Help us to see that you're a God who is worth following and living for even today, in the context of all the challenges of culture, in the context of all the political climate of this nation. Help us, O Lord, to be effective in your hands even today. Use us, glorify your name, and accomplish your will. Thank you for this time. Speak to us even through the week. In Jesus' name we pray. Thank you, and see you all next week.